Hello everybody, this is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to our Kiev Major group phase recap. We're going to look ahead to the playoff bracket here starting in just a few hours. I'm really excited to be able to bring this to you guys. It's been an amazing tournament so far. As we look back on the group phase results, here are the top 5 teams coming out of our Swiss format. 2 teams at 3-0 and 3 more sitting at 3-1. I wanted to point out, as we mentioned in that first day 1 recap video, 4 out of the top 5 teams, when the dust settles, are qualified teams. Only OG joins the 4 qualified teams, and arguably OG probably looking the shakiest out of this group so far. We're going to start, of course, with Team Secret. This is a team on a 19-game win streak. So with one more win in the group phase, if they can win their opening match, in the playoff phase, they're going to join that rarefied air 20-game win streaks. Only a handful of those ever in the history of Pro Dota. You, of course, had Alliance, which I believe had 23. Newbie holds the record with 29. I believe Faceless actually had a 20-plus win streak at one point. But still, great accomplishment for Secret, considering that the majority of these games, in fact, I believe all of these games have been in the Kiev Major EU qualifiers, which was a loaded region, and in the Major itself. They've bought only 5 total Midases in 6 games in this tournament, which is going to stand out because we're going to talk a little bit about this is the Midas Major, which I'm a little bit dubious on, but we'll get there eventually. 3 of those, in fact, are by Pile Die. So Secret has not been playing greedy. They've been dominating opponents, playing great Dota. They seem to have a great grasp of the meta so far. Virtus Pro, the other team, undefeated in series. They've dropped only a single match, that to Wings, a game in which they had almost a 20K net worth advantage, and Wings turned it around by almost 30K in 10 minutes to take that match. But otherwise, VP have looked nearly flawless. They've had 4 matches under 35 minutes and 3 over 50 minutes. So it's kind of interesting. Lil and I were talking a little bit about the Midas trend on Twitter, and what he was saying is that a lot of teams, and I've since had this confirmed by several other players that I've talked to, a lot of teams look at this as we don't necessarily know exactly where this meta is going to go right now. A lot of teams are valuing Midas as late game insurance, and you can kind of see that in VP. Previous iterations of this team, they looked like they only really know how to play one style of Dota, where they come at you fast and furious, they rack up the kills, they rack up the action, but they still continue to press that action even when they're not necessarily at an advantage. It's a small sample of games, but I really like the fact that this VP team looks comfortable shifting to a more controlled game pace. They say, all right, if we look like we're not going to be able to win by 35 minutes, we're comfortable buying a couple of Midases and taking the game a little bit late. I really like that control. I thought for a long time that that was the #1 thing they had to do to be a truly elite, consistent team. But if you look at their numbers, they're #1 in team GPM and in kills per game. Ramses is the only player over 700 GPM in the tournament so far, and these are not Alchemist games, folks. These are legit numbers. Very, very impressive what they've done. IG, a lot of people, of course, surprised about that Secret series. IG looked like pretty clearly the best team in the tournament after day 1 of the groups. Came out the following morning, lost 0-2 in that series against Secret. I think that's a little bit deceiving. I think you can still make a case for IG being one of the best, if not the best teams in the tournament based on the performance so far. 3 out of the 4 opponents that they've faced so far have been in the top 7 by DatDota ELO ranking. So they've faced some very, very strong competition in this Swiss format. Now, the one thing I worried about, I brought this up when Merlini and I were talking about compendium predictions. IG has only picked or banned 29 different heroes so far, and that's the fewest in the tournament. The other 2 teams coming in that category at 32, that's the next fewest, are Secret and Virtus Pro, the 2 teams that only played 3 series. So that is, to me, a little bit of a concern for IG. As dominant a player as Boboka has looked in particular, and I think along with DAC, this tournament so far has really been his coming out party, similar to what we saw at the Frankfurt Major last year with Crit and Jerax. He's established himself as one of the dominant 4-position players that we've seen in the last several years in professional Dota. IG as a team, though, still working on a rather limited hero pool compared to some of the other top teams. That's a little bit of a concern for me as we go into the playoff bracket. And the reason I think that game against Secret, that series against Secret rather, was a little bit potentially misleading. They bought 6 Midases in 2 games in that loss to Secret, including 4 in game 2, and that's almost as much as they bought combined as a team for the rest of the tournament. So I think they got just a little bit over greedy, and Secret, if anything, consistently in these games is showing us that they're capable of punishing that late game greed super, super hard. OG, in the meantime, little bit shaky so far. When you look at the fact that 3 of the 4 opponents that they've played so far in these series are outside our top 10 ELO rankings, and they're the only top 5 team. They're the only team in this group that didn't win a series 2-0. They're 0-3 with Arc Warden. Some of their drafts have they've looked like they've even outthought themselves at times. They've been playing very, very greedy. Fly has the most Midases purchased in the tournament so far with 7. I think OG needs to make some adjustments if they expect to win this tournament. But again, they are right now the team in Dota that's most capable of making those adjustments between the group and the playoff phase. If you look all the way back to that same Frankfurt Major, of course, the OG that showed up and made that incredible run through the lower bracket, very different from the team that showed up in the group phase of that tournament. So I think that they're going to be fine going into those series. All right. When you look at sort of the middle of the bracket, these are the 6 teams that finished with the 2-2 record. Liquid is the one of these teams, despite being sort of on paper the 6th seed. They're the one of these teams that I may be the most concerned for. If you look in their last 3 months of play, Liquid is 16-1 in games that end between 20 and 30 minutes. They're 14-16 in games that go 40 minutes or longer. Now, of course, when you look at this kind of a stat, every top team is going to have shorter matches on average in their wins than their losses, and that's simply due to skill disparity. Okay, top teams tend to put away weaker teams in very quick matches. We all know that. Still, when you look at a split of this magnitude, there's a reason that they use actual numbers in these analyses, guys. The magnitude of this split is what's really important. If you look all the way back since the release of 7.0, Liquid has a 16-minute split, 16-minute duration differential between their wins and their losses. They're losing late games and winning quick ones, and that is by far the most of any team during that period with 30 or more games, and it's even very, very large when you look historically performances of top teams over similar periods. Liquid has a problem with its late game right now that does need to be addressed if they expect to go far in this tournament, and that potentially plays into their first round matchup, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. DC, very interesting team. I think this is, of course, the new squad playing under that DC flag, led by this young superstar Abed and captained by the SEA, the MVP alum Dubu. Very, very good team. All 5 of their losses, they're almost the opposite of Liquid so far in this tournament. All 5 of their losses have been 36 minutes or shorter, and of their remaining 5 wins, 1 was 37 minutes, and the others were all over 50 minutes. So they, so far in this tournament, have been almost exclusively a late game team. To me, it's also a little bit interesting. There have actually been 10 Meepo bans so far in this tournament. All 10 of them have been against DC, 9 of them in the first phase. So teams definitely respecting the heck out of that Abed Meepo, as you would expect, as I know from experience. All right, Thunderbirds. Been a little bit of a mixed bag for them so far. I still believe that this team has a lot of potential to make some noise in the playoff bracket. They're the only team that's played the full 12 out of a possible 12 game in 4 series. All of their series have gone to a game 3. I think they've showcased some very impressive variety from their core position players. Resolution and Weeha are number 1 and number 2 in the tournament with 10 and 9 different heroes. Resolution has the 10 respectively. They've showcased a lot of variety. They're 4-1 with Saxa and Rubik. I'm very surprised that they haven't gone to that particular pick more often. In fact, you know, RIP Compendium, Rubik was actually going to be my most picked hero going into this tournament. That is certainly not going to happen now. Sorry about that, guys, but I'm a little bit surprised that some of these teams that have really high impact Rubik players have not gone to that hero a little bit more often. T-Birds have tended to play very, very greedy in their losses. They built 9 Midases in 2 losses against TNC. They built 13 total in their 10 other games, all right? All of their players have built 3 Midases or more. So to me, it's fine to play greedy, and I think Thunderbirds have the kind of lineup where 1 through 5, they're all capable of making a tremendous impact on the game when they get farmed, but they're going to need to be very, very selective about that come playoff time. As we'll talk about in some of our other series breakdowns, I just don't think you can be a dedicated late game team in this era of Dota. There are too many ways for opponents to punish that, not only by countering your individual heroes, but teams now have a great understanding of tempo and overall lineup counters, just picking a 5-hero lineup that's going to be strong at points in the game where the opposition is going to be weak. So I think going into games, banking on getting to that late game is a very dangerous strategy. Now, Newbie, again, this is Liquid's first round matchup in the playoffs. 49-minute average game length. That's the largest of any team in the tournament. One of the things that I've really noticed from Newbie, they've had a lot of their success when we talk about them dominating the Chinese regional leagues, H Cup and DPL coming into this tournament. They've had a lot of success with SCCC just putting up huge farming numbers. He had 722 GPM. That was tops on the board at DAC, despite the team only going 9-11. So he is capable of putting up these huge farming numbers. They're putting him on more traditional sort of team fight oriented mid heroes. They're 0-4 with him on Lena and Puck compared to 3-0 with him on Invoker and SF. I really do think that going into this playoff bracket, if they're going to play for the late game, which they generally have done, they need to get SCCC back onto these more farm-intensive heroes. Now, that's not to take anything away from UU9, who's had a fantastic tournament so far and is actually up there in the overall tournament leaders if you look at KDA, kills per game, etc. But I think for Newbie to be the top team that we all expected when they got a direct invite to this tournament, they need SCCC back, putting up those huge farming numbers. Speaking of farming, Evil Geniuses doing their usual thing. They have been by far the most efficient creep farming team in the tournament. They're averaging over 1,200 team last hits in a 45-minute match average. That's by far the average team last hit per minute lead in the tournament. Very efficient farming around the map. It's been the book on EG for a long time. First of all, that they start tournaments slow. That's nothing new. But second of all, that they are such a ridiculously efficient farming team. They are going to make you come to them in order to beat them. And I think that that makes them a threat as we go into this playoff phase, despite the fact that Sumail hasn't necessarily had vintage Sumail numbers going into this tournament. We expect him every lane he plays now, he's been so good for so long, to be up there in the leaders in kills and KD. He's actually only at 7.5 kills a game at this tournament. Hasn't necessarily showcased the explosiveness that we expect. We've actually even seen him get killed a couple times solo in lane, which is just like, I mean, obviously in this kind of a meta, the last couple metas with early rotations by supports, that happens to everybody, but still Sumail, you really look at that and go, what's going on? I think he's going to be fine. I'm not saying that Sumail's in any kind of trouble, but they need him to be the kind of player that showed up at DAC, at TI6, at these vintage, at TI5 in order to win this tournament. All right. Just as a quick aside before we go on, we'll talk about some of the other teams as we break down the specific bracket matchups. The Swiss group format has been absolutely amazing. This has been by far the most fun I've ever had watching the group stage of a major LAN tournament. I think these matches have been amazing. And by the way, that is saying something considering I had to watch this one from home. I've been sitting here screaming at my monitor. It's been such great theater. My gut is that TI7 is probably going to stay round robin. I'm seeing a lot of discussion discussion in the last couple of days about maybe keeping this format for future majors. The big advantage statistically of the Swiss format over round robin is that you get almost as much information. You get almost as much of a complete ranking of the teams from 1 to 16 in a much smaller potential number of games with the Swiss format. With round robin, you get a lot of information ranking the teams from best to worst, from top to bottom, but you have to play a lot of games in order to do so. I think TI generally lends itself, we want to see a lot of Dota at TI, generally lends itself to like a 3 to 4 day group phase, and in that I think you're probably going to see them stick with round robin. I wouldn't have a problem with them going to Swiss. That's my gut. I think they'll stay with the traditional TI format. The two things that I would change: number one, a 16-team, 4-round Swiss group phase should probably be played in 3 days and not 2. The first reason for this is it's nearly unavoidable if you do it in a 2-day format that some of the teams that play the very last series on day 1 are going to end up playing the first series on day 2. That's something that every LAN I go to when I'm talking to these organizers, that's something teams really don't like. There's a good reason why they don't like it. That's something that we really try to avoid, and I would hope to see that done a little bit more carefully in the future. It also just makes for very long days, okay? Very long days for players. You know, even Red Eye is not at his best when he's been at a desk for 15 hours. I know that's almost blasphemy. He does such a great job as host. And even the viewers, it's very, very hard to keep a viewer's attention for 15 hours or more, even with the great Dota that we've had. The other thing is, this is actually a little bit anti-statistician of me. I would consider carrying the round 2 seedings on into the round 1 seedings on into round 2. Traditionally, what makes the Swiss format so effective statistically is actually that the best teams play each other very early on. But to me, just looking at how it affected the overall bracket dynamic, I ended up really not liking that IG and OG had to face off so early in round 2. I would much preferred those two teams getting together and facing each other in round 3. This does, by the way, in fact, if you actually want to make the Swiss format optimal, there have been some people that have done some math and actually suggested that you should do it the opposite. You should have what are called accelerated pairings, where you actually have the top 2 teams that won in the first round play each other in round 2. I just think in terms of overall bracket balance, which is important despite the fact that you're going for a Swiss format, I'd like to see those round 1 pairings kept, those round 1 seedings kept going into round 2. You have to get rid of them for the latter 2 rounds, because otherwise it screws with the format and potentially messes up the tiebreakers pretty badly. But I do think you should keep them going into the second round. All right, when you look at overall the group phase meta, we talked in the first video about how the meta has really shifted dramatically since DAC, even a couple of weeks ago. This is one of the biggest meta shifts that we've seen in a short period of time in Pro Dota 2, especially given that a lot of people weren't sure just how big the impacts of the 7.05 patch was going to be. Little bit peculiarly, Monkey King is still remaining tied for the top pick in the tournament despite only a 35% win rate. Now, this is still up substantially from day 1 where he was just abysmal. He actually did quite a bit better in day 2, but when you look at a hero like this, 31 picks, 29 of them in the first phase, this is a hero that has underperformed so far. Crystal Maiden, which was a hero that a lot of people did pick and I should have picked for most picked overall in the tournament. I think compendium-wise, that's going to end up being the right answer. She's tied for the top pick spot. You can see it's a little bit more balanced there. It's mostly the Chinese and SEA teams that are taking her early in the draft, but I think she's a very solid hero. You can see that in the win rate. Going down the board, I thought Magnus was going to get a little bit more action. He's been picked in the first phase, but what we've seen is that there are certain teams that are really still comfortable and still confident in their Magnus strats, and there are certain teams that have just gone away from that entirely. So as usual for single elimination, opponent-specific scouting is going to play a really big role. Variety-wise, we've had 96 different heroes picked. Now, it's going to be really interesting for that compendium category. I do expect that for the single elimination playoffs, we're going to go back to much more conservative, much safer drafting for most of the games. So I'm not I'm not entirely sure we're going to break that 100 mark, although if I had the compendium to do over again, I probably would have picked 100 plus. One of the things that's flown under the radar, not only have we had 96 different heroes picked, we've had 54 different heroes picked in phase 1. That to me is just as indicative of the overall meta balance as the total number, because what you've seen oftentimes as metas in the past is that there's a lot of variety in the back end of these drafts, but there's still these clear top tier heroes that are dominant, that are picked and banned in almost every first phase. That's not the case. You compare it to Boston, in all of the Boston Major, there were only 48 different heroes picked in the first phase of the draft, and there were 57 in all of TI6. So we're seeing the meta really wide open right now, particularly those draft opens. And that's what, as a strategist looking so much at these teams, the 2-hero open in the draft, I think, defines so much of your team's strategy and overall drafting style, and there are so many viable choices there right now. Meta's just in a great place. In terms of other notable heroes, TA is 9-1. It's pretty impressive there. We've had some very strong TA players on that hero in the tournament. Lifestealer continues to disappoint. He's only 2-8. I mean, this was a hero that was hotly contested throughout DAC, in the top 5 most picked heroes in that tournament with nearly a 60% win rate. This hero has fallen very far in a short period of time. Those nerfs have hit him hard. Arc Warden is only 1-5. I'm actually surprised that we've seen this hero picked up 3 times. Of course, 3 of those were OG losses, so I don't necessarily know that you're going to see a whole lot more of that hero. And as we said, Meepo has almost exclusively showed up. Of course, we got to play him once, but he's almost exclusively showed up as a ban, and that against Digital Chaos. So speaking of those bans, Treant Protector, a lot of teams just don't want to deal with this hero. He is by far the most banned, and 38 of those 39 bans have come in the first phase. So this is just a hero that a lot of teams want to take out of that first phase entirely. A little bit surprising to me that Wisp has come back in a pretty big way and is actually the 2nd most banned hero overall. That was to give credit where credit was due. A lot of people in the comments and on Reddit, when I put up that compendium prediction video, questioned me not talking about either of Treant or Wisp as most banned. And you guys have turned out to be right. Those are 2 heroes that teams just don't want to face. The Monkey King bans you would expect, especially just because so many teams are still picking it. I wonder if that's not going to trail off by the time that we get to those playoff phases. The other thing, you're actually seeing CM move up into the most banned, which is very, very unusual. Typically, it's only been the roaming supports, the Earth Spirit and the Monkey King, that teams have been spending bans on. CM is the first support in a while that teams have really been banning out a lot, which is, to me, really cool. It speaks to the potential of the hero. All right, so highlighting some really neat individual performances. A couple of these we talked about in the first video, but I just think it's worth giving another shout out. Raven, one of the all-time great performances. He had 33 kills on his Spectre against Thunderbirds. That is by far a record for single game all time at a Valve event. Just an unbelievable performance there. On day 2, Abed had 40 assists on his Ember Spirit in a long game against Liquid. That total is top 5 all time at all Valve events. So just an incredibly impressive player, a guy that a lot of us have been watching for some time now. Looks like he's really blossoming on this new DC squad. Mid One and Ramses, of course, 2 of the core position players for teams that have done very well in the tournament overall, but their numbers have been really impressive. Mid One in particular, he's averaging 0.3 kills per minute in the 6 games that he's had at this tournament. No other player in the tournament is over 0.25. So very impressive. When you're talking about he's averaging 20% more kills per minute than any other player at the event, it's a small sample size, but his performances have been really impressive. I believe he tweeted out, "All you qualified teams, I'm coming for you," before the event, and he certainly has. Ramses, again, in a raw number sense, this is nothing new. This kid is a phenom. 706 GPM, by far the highest average of any player in the tournament, and these are not Alchemist games. 9.24 KDA, again, top mark of all the players in the tournament. What might be more impressive to me, though, actually possibly the single most impressive number at the tournament that's flown under the radar, Puppy, through 6 games has actually been in on over 90% of Team Secret's total kills. He's been in on 141 out of 156 kills. This is a guy that has shown his ability as a captain, as a shot caller, of course, over years and years. But in terms of his actual individual gameplay, he has played so well so far during this tournament, hoping he keeps it up for a deep playoff run. And something, just a number that stood out to me that I thought was really cool, VP actually had a 35-minute win against Faceless where both of their supports recorded over 30 assists. That's very, very unusual. I'm going to have Knoxville go back and see how often that's happened in Dota history, but it doesn't happen very often, I can tell you right now. And those two supports playing about as well as any support duo in the game now for quite some time, in my opinion. Now, this is kind of an aside. I wanted to talk about the sort of Midas debate. Again, I don't want to get too sidetracked into this. Okay, slides. Hello, PowerPoint. Let's behave. There we go. All right. When you look at the numbers for the tournament so far, 5 or more Midases purchased in 11 out of 74 matches, and that's 5 or more Midases combined on both sides compared to only 5 matches with 0 Midases so far. So the rate at which Midases are being picked up, much higher than in any event in recent memory. We do have 14 players that have purchased 5 or more Midases in their group phase games. 6 of them are offlaners. That to me makes a bit of sense because of some of the factors that we're going to talk about in a second. Individually, Fly had the most purchases with 7. Again, I do think being a little bit more selective with their greedy play is going to be a key for OG if they hope to repeat as major champions. Just to sort of lay it out, because I've had this debate now with a couple of people on Twitter and privately, there is a case in terms of theory crafting for why 7.05 might lend itself to being more Midas favorable. The single biggest thing is probably the fact that those neutral camp timers are now no longer on a no longer on a 1-minute cycle. They're on a 2-minute cycle. The longer neutral respawn times means that there's a resource crunch, and on paper, this is something that when the change was made, a lot of people said, including myself, thought, okay, this maybe isn't such a big deal because they've added a couple of additional camps. There are, in some ways, more farming opportunities for all the lanes now. So that's going to offset the longer respawn clock. What happens, though, is that because of the longer respawn clock, it's much more common in a lot of these games watching the replays to see 1 or 2 cores. Basically, all the camps get stacked, and then at that every 2-minute respawn, 1 or 2 cores just go and they clear out all of the camps. Whereas before, there were only a couple of very high mobility heroes, high mobility cores that could basically farm all of those stacked camps on the map at once. You would basically have at least a couple of the camps open for being farmed by an offlaner or a support as that 1 or 2 position player was going back to lane to pick up a creep wave. Now, a lot of teams have it so that their 1 and 2 position players are always farming all of those stacked neutral camps. So it's the dynamic element that can really make the map seem crunched at a lot of times for offlaners and support. So that's why most of the big Midas purchasers so far in the tournament have been offlaners. The other part of the mathematics is, of course, talents. There are a lot of the level 15, 20, and 25 talents that are a very, very crucial part of different heroes' kits, not just of their ability to scale into the late game, but just their overall hero power level is very dependent on reaching those thresholds. There are some of this is kind of a smaller effect, but I do think it matters in the overall calculus. Some of the plus damage talents on specific heroes like CM and Puck mean the plus 30 attack speed. I mean, it's not that much, but on those particular heroes, it may actually matter. You probably should be getting a Midas on CM with that plus damage talent, that big plus damage talent sitting at level 10. And I think the other big factor this is something I credit Lil and Sunby both for pointing out to me on Twitter, is that there's just a lot of meta uncertainty right now. There are a lot of teams that feel like, okay, we have a pretty good game plan. We have a pretty good draft. We think we're going to be able to finish the game by the low 30s or maybe 40 minutes. But we want that contingency plan if the game goes late. There are just a lot of teams that feel like this meta is not completely understood, that the other team is going to be able to take it late, and it becomes a little bit of a tightrock at that point. So there is some insurance value. There's definitely risk aversion at work when you talk about teams' valuation of these Midases. That said, I still think Midas has been way overbought in this tournament. Look for me on Twitter a little bit later. Unfortunately, we had a bug in our code with that Dota. We don't have parsed Midas stats yet. I'd hope to be able to get you the records of 3, 4, and 5 Midas strategies against teams that purchase 2 or fewer. Just by hand count, I believe 4 and 5 Midas strats were 2 and 7 overall during the group phase, but don't trust that number. Again, I'll tweet the parse numbers based on hard data out a little bit later. I still think it's been overpurchased. If you just do the quick math, okay, assuming that you're using Midas on range creeps, and the discrepancy between range creeps and the big satyrs or the troll summoner is actually, it's not that big. So you're going to assume that Midas is always used on range creeps and that it's never on cooldown. It's going to take almost exactly 14 minutes. It's like 13.9 minutes or something. It's almost exactly 14 minutes that the Midas will pay for itself gold-wise, okay? The median match length so far at Kiev has been about 38 minutes, and yet we're seeing Midases purchased fairly routinely by supports and offlaners in the 20 to 24 minute zone. So on average, these Midases are barely breaking even. Now, the late game insurance factor is definitely plays in there, but as badly as we've seen some of these greedy multi-Midas strats get punished in the group phase, I think I would really think twice going into the playoff bracket about relying on something like that. The other thing, obviously, is you ask, what about XP? So in 14 minutes, in that same 14 minutes that it takes the Midas to pay for itself, Midas is going to give you about 630 XP if used on range creeps. That's about half a level between 13 and 19. So it doesn't really give you that much of a boost in terms of getting to those 20 and 25 talents. And I do think it's telling. Obviously, pub stats aren't always telling for the pro game, but if you look, there are 24 heroes with plus XP talents in the pub game right now. Only 5 of those heroes have positive win rate differentials. So I don't necessarily buy the argument that, oh, XP is huge, you always want to get to these later talents, and I'm just resistant to this Midas meta movement in general. I think there are still a lot of items. Force Staff is still really good, guys. Glimmer Cape is still really good. Solar Crest is actually, in my opinion, broken right now. There are a lot of good items in that 2 to 3K range that are very viable on your supports and on your offlaner. Please don't spam Midas season pubs. All right, so talking about the first round matchups, here we're going to see the bracket in order. I think Secret 2-0 over SG. There's really not too much to talk about there. SG did a good thing when they were able to take a game, their opening game of the tournament, off of OG. They actually had some competitive matches in their second couple series, but I think Secret, as good as they've looked so far, they're going to take care of business here. EG versus Thunderbirds is definitely the closest of the first round matchups. These two teams have not faced each other in a series going all the way back to TI6. Presumably they do a lot of scrimming against each other, but this is the renewing of a rivalry that we haven't seen in some time. I am going to give EG a slight edge here. I think if Thunderbirds allows this to turn into any kind of a farm fest, and again, Thunderbirds have been playing on balance fairly greedy so far during this tournament. If they allow this to turn into a farm fest, I think EG is going to win this series, quite simply. I give Thunderbirds a pretty good chance if they can survive, if they can surprise EG at the tail end of the draft. I think the versatility of Resolution and Wii, very, very important coming into the series. I think there's the potential for Thunderbirds to just flat out outdraft, but I think that they need to do that and they need to play a little bit more aggression than they've shown in the group phase if they're going to beat the very, very efficient EG squad. TNC and Faceless, I mean, it kind of broke my heart when I saw this as a first round playoff pairing. TNC has been the Cinderella team so far in this tournament. We've talked about Raven, but I think Sam H and Tim's have played as well or better than anybody else at the 3 and 4 positions that we've seen. They've put together some amazing games. Faceless is like their kryptonite. I've looked at a couple of the replays from these two teams facing each other. It looks at times like they just don't know what to do with Daryl. They spend a lot of they fall into the same trap that a lot of SEA teams do. They tend to spend like 4 out of their 5 bans on Ice heroes. And Daryl just looks like he has a really good sense of how to disrupt those Tims and Sam H rotations. He's generally playing more of a greedy hero, whereas Sam H is generally playing more of the traditional team fight initiators like a Darkseer. And Daryl just looks like he's able to give them problems starting in the laning phase and really prevent their evolution and their free rotations throughout the game. So TNC, I think if they're going to take this series, reverse that trend against Faceless, they need those 3 and 4 positions really to dominate. And that's a tall order. Faceless, very, very strong and very unique, really, at those particular roles. Team Random, Wings is the X-Wing squad. Very scary matchup in the opening round for an OG squad that has not been playing their best Dota. Team Random so far has 53 different heroes picked or banned. The second highest team is 44. So again, rip me for the compendium, but they're probably going to easily win that category, especially as I expect the playoff drafts to be a little more conservative. Just to show you how close this was, OG against Team Random in the deciding match of the series that they played in the group phase. That was a dead even game at the 45-minute mark. And in fact, Team Random had the edge, not a huge one, but they had the edge for most of the first 45 minutes. OG was able to dramatically turn that game in the last 15 minutes and take it. But this is a tighter matchup, I think, than any of us expected OG having to deal with in the first round. I still do give them the edge, but they are going to need to be very selective with those greedy strats. Going to the other half of the bracket, VP, of course, are the heavy favorites. This is one where I don't think this series is nearly as lopsided on paper as the Secret versus SG matchup. IG Vitality is a very talented team. They're a team that as recently as a couple of months ago, we were talking about as potentially the next big mover and shaker team out of China. They have very talented players. They just have struggled to find a consistent identity and a consistent drafting style. We've seen them try to play very fast Dota more recently. We'd seen them with more of a farming focus at several points early on. They just don't look like they've found a formula that has worked for them, but I think they can take a game off VP, although I'd be very surprised if they win that series. VGJ, this is in some ways a very bad matchup for them against Digital Chaos. DC by no means unbeatable. I think in particular, when you look at the numbers for DC, Abed has obviously been among the players of the tournament. Demon and Bulba, both their numbers and looking at a few of the team's replays, they've played decently, but they've not played that well by their standards. There still have been some mistakes, particularly in the first 20 minutes of matches. They really need to clean that up. They need very strong play out of their veteran 3 and 4 position roles. The thing that I think makes DC dangerous, first of all, they're playing against a team that has been on the longer side stylistically, so they're going to be able, I think, to have some success playing the same brand of Dota that they did in the group phase. But I also look at DC and I look at the fact that they're captained by Dubu, a guy that has experience with Team MVP. I think DC has another gear that they haven't shown yet in this tournament. I think this DC team is perfectly capable of playing 30 to 35, of playing to win at 30 to 35 minutes. And I think if they can trot that out and surprise a couple teams with that style here in the playoffs, they could actually be very dangerous, potentially even threatening Virtus Pro in the second round. But to me, again, it's all about how well Demon and Bulba can actually perform. So a lot of people have looked at IG against Mouse, the former Ad Venom squad, and they've said, oh, hey, same script for the former Ad Venom guys as in Boston. No, okay? Yes, it is true that Ad Finum, they looked pretty shaky in the group phase in Boston. They were playing against really, really good teams. They played, I believe, if I'm remembering right, they played 2 series against eHome, 1 against Newbie, and 1 against OG at Boston, which were all teams that were playing very, very well coming into that tournament. They've not played nearly as strong a competition here in their group phase games. They've been very uneven. That final series loss for them to VGJ was really something that I looked at and said, I just don't think that these guys are nearly on their same form. And yes, you know, we all remember going back to the Boston Major. Their big run through that bracket started with what many considered a first-round upset of LGD Forever Young. So again, they face a Chinese team in the first round. I just wouldn't buy it. When you look back, you could have made an argument at that tournament that LGD Forever Young was actually the weakest team in their, or second weakest team in their region. Invictus Gaming might be the strongest team overall in the tournament so far. I think Midas has their work cut out for them, and I'd be very cautious about picking the upset there. And that's nothing against those 5 players. I am actually a huge fanboy of that Ad Finum squad, have been for a long time since I got to see them play in person, but I think that this is a very, very bad matchup for them. This is not a Farm Fest IG team. This is a team that's perfectly comfortable mixing it up, putting Burning on fighting carries, having him go an early Vanguard on his anti-mage now. I think this is a very hard matchup for Midas. The stylistic contrast of the first round to me, though, is this Liquid versus Newbie matchup. Liquid desperately need to find a way to fix that late game. Some of their late game, I think we've seen really a couple things from them. We've seen some shaky late game decision making, but we also have seen matches where they've looked like they really have been pressing at the 35 to 45 minute mark to try to avoid going into the late game. And that in itself has put them in some very disadvantageous situations. So I think in addition to making sure that that late game decision making is sound, I think Liquid just need to have that confidence. They are still, I mean, this is still, you can make an argument as the most talented team on paper in the world. This is a team that's perfectly capable of executing flawlessly at the tail end of the mid game. They don't need to play with this sense of urgency like the other team's always going to beat them late. And unfortunately, they're playing against an opponent, Newbie, who has one of the longest overall average match durations in Pro Dota this year. This is a team that loves to take it to the late game. Liquid, I think this is all about them just getting their mojo back, playing with that confidence, saying, look, we're going to play our usual game, try to end it at 35 minutes, but if we go past that, we're fine. We've got really, really good players. Unfortunately, they're playing a very talented team on the other side. So that to me, EG Thunderbirds and Liquid Newbie are the two sort of coin tosses of the first round. I'm going to give the slight edge to EG, and I'm going to give, this series, it's very, very hard to call. I will go ahead and take Newbie. That feels like I'm betraying Kuro, but I had Newbie as actually one of my top 4 teams coming in. I'm not quite ready to bail on them completely in the overall bracket. Unfortunately, I believe there's an overwhelming likelihood that Newbie will have to play IG in the second round, and I just don't see them winning a series with IG, even though I think they have the talent to make it very, very close. VP has a very favorable draw for them in terms of making it to the finals. They are most likely going to face off against Digital Chaos in the second round, although VGJ has a pretty decent chance of pulling that upset. I think that's about maybe a 65-35 series. I do think, though, the VP DC series is really going to come down to whether or not they have that extra gear that we're going to talk about earlier. You're not going to beat VP by drafting to win in 55 minutes. They're going to see right through that, and they're capable of just blitzing you in the early game. You're not going to beat VP playing as Abed and 4 other guys, okay? You're going to need the rest of DC to step up in a very big way. And by the way, Mason's actually been playing very well. Not enough people are talking about that. But specifically, you're going to need Sam and Jimmy to step up. You're going to need Dubu to shift them into that other gear, really pull out some of those vintage MVP drafts and take it to VP in order for them to be competitive in that series. On the other side of the bracket, I'm from Missouri, guys. I'm a show me state kind of dude. Until TNC show me that they can put together that same special combination of drafting and play against Faceless that they've shown against other teams, I have to play the odds and take Faceless, despite the fact that I think TNC's been the story of the tournament so far. It's really a shame that they get this matchup. I will take OG over Team Random, although that makes me very nervous. I actually think if OG can beat Team Random, that they have a very good shot of making it to the grand finals. I'll take EG, as I said, in a nail biter over Thunderbirds. I would be shocked if that series weren't 2-1 in either direction. Secret, I think, is going to roll, obviously. I'm going to go ahead and take Secret over EG in round 2. If there's one thing that Secret have shown so far in this tournament, it's that you can be efficient farming on the other side. Secret are still going to find ways to punish you. So I think stylistically, unless, again, EG can make some adjustments going into that series, that Secret have a pretty substantial edge. And I'm going to go ahead and put my money at this point on an IG versus Secret final. I believe what I see so far from Team Secret. By the way, I believe what I see so far from VP too. I don't think either of these two teams got there. This is a Swiss format. Neither of those two teams got there by facing weak opposition. So I wouldn't be surprised to see either of those two teams face off in the grand finals. But the way the brackets fall out, I think Secret has a slightly easier path to get there. I'm going to go ahead and go with an IG versus Secret grand final, and I think IG is going to win at this point. But really, any of those 4 teams that I have slotted into the semifinals would not be surprised to see them win. Guys, this is going to be an amazing tournament. I'll try to maybe do another one of these after day 1. No promises, but this has been a lot of fun to watch so far, and it's been a lot of fun producing content for y'all. So I got some great feedback on the first video. Thank you for that. This is Nahaz. Enjoy the rest of the tournament, and I will talk to you soon.